What's up, Joe? What's up, everybody? I'm Jeff Fannell, and this is Sports 360. Today we have noted economist Ev Ehrlich on the podcast. Ev has spent many years advising the players' associations in baseball, hockey, and soccer on the ins and outs of sports industry economics. Ev joins us today to talk about the state of economics in sports, where things stand, and where things are going. And he does it in a style that is all his own. We have an enlightening discussion on tap, and we're about to get going. So stay with us on Sports 360. Well, I'm pleased today to have with me on the podcast Ev Ehrlich. I don't know, Ev, if I need to call you Dr. Ev Ehrlich, an economist
Not
who has
at this
done a lot of
point.
interesting things in sports, and we just want to talk a little bit about that today. So, Ev, how you doing?
I'm doing real well, and I'm glad to be here.
Good, good. Yeah, I had to, I was reading your bio recently, and I saw it said Dr. Ev Ehrlich. Anybody call you Dr. Ev?
Dr. Ev, no. But listen, people have called me worse.
And I'm sure they've called you better too.
There you
Um,
go.
you, you know what, Ab, I will tell you this. When I was thinking about having this conversation with you, I'll be honest. I had a sort of a mixture of expectation because I think you're going to have some really interesting things to share, but also some trepidation. And the trepidation was, there's a lot of jokes about lawyers, right?
Uh-huh.
You you've probably told your share of lawyer jokes over the
Yes,
years,
I
but
have.
one of the things that they often say about those who choose the legal profession is they choose it because they can't do math, right? And I don't believe that's true, right? I was an engineering major when I first started out in college, but
Mm.
even if I can do a little bit of math, I can't do the math like you can do the math, Ev. I mean, you've done some great things in terms of the economics and being able to look at and analyze numbers. And so I want to be able to get into that, and especially as it pertains to sports. Um, and when did you and I first meet? I was trying to pinpoint it. I think it was in the early 2000s, maybe.
Yes, it would. It was in 2004, which was the first executive board of the Baseball Players Association that I attended. And I remember looking at you and thinking, who's that guy? I say, well, the cat's not a player, and I don't know him yet, but they might have people tucked around here that I haven't figured out.
That's right. That's right.
There you
So it's early 2000, 2004. But I mean, you started out. You didn't start out working in sports, right? I mean, I know you've been involved in industry and politics, and in addition to sports. So, can you tell us a little bit about that in terms of how you got started, and then how it was that you transitioned into sports?
All right, there you go. Um, well, I was living the life of an economist. I kind of slept my way to the middle, and I'd worked. I taught for a little bit at the University of Maryland in Baltimore. I worked in the office of Congressman John Conyers. I worked at the Congressional Budget Office. I then became a corporate executive at Unisys, and somewhere along the way, and so I was doing that, and I wasn't thinking about sports. I grew up in New York in the 50s, so baseball was religion, and I was, always really focused on baseball. Um, and when stuff was happening like Messerschmitt and McNally, it was great. It combined the two things I was most interested in, baseball and the struggle of the working class. So in 90 or 91, a mutual friend told me to go see his buddy, Bob Gilhooly, who was at the time, with his partner, Jim Bronner, a
Right.
path-blazing agent. And I got the chance to meet him during a layover on a flight in Chicago. Went out to his office. We spent a couple of hours together, and we went nuts. We ended up talking about how you would apply portfolio theory to roster construction and stuff like that. And a couple days later, I got a call from the mother of us all, Lauren Rich,
Hmm.
over at the Ball
Yeah.
Players. And she said, I just got a call from Bob Gilhooly. He says, I need to meet you right away. And suddenly I was in New York, and I met with Lauren, and she took me in to meet Don Fear, and we began a kind of on-again, off-again relationship. During the 94 strike, I was the Undersecretary of Commerce in the Clinton administration, so both Don Fear and I wanted to keep our hands clean about what I was doing. But when I left the administration, I sort of began a more involved relationship with the Players. In 2004, I sort of came on full-time, part-time, and have done that in some form ever since.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. And you often hear about, sometimes even with lawyers, and you're an economist, and people who were making their living in other ways, of how they got into sports. And it was some either a chance meeting, or a meeting that was set up, then one thing led to another, and certainly that seems to be the case with you. So, but once you got on board, Ev, I mean, how would you summarize, and it may be difficult to do this, but how would you summarize the work that that you performed for the MLBPA?
All right. Well, first, let me pick up on something you said, because it's exactly what I tell folks when they ask me this question: how do you get into sports? I say, well, unless you're willing to be the assistant marketing guy in the minor leagues, meaning you boil the hot dogs, go get good at
Right.
something else and then come in.
Yeah.
So there's, for the folks who are listening for that point, I think that's true.
Yeah, and Ev,
But
can I just
go
add to
on.
that, because you're right. I mean, even for me as a lawyer, that was part of my experience. I mean, I interned at the PA back in 95, 96, my last year of
Uh-huh.
law school. But, Gene Orza, he said, look, we don't hire right out of law school. He said, go learn to be a lawyer, and so, I went out and I worked at the board for a year, and then I was at the AFL-CIO for 3 years, and then got the opportunity to come back. So it was sort of the same thing, right? Go be good at something
Yep.
else, and then maybe, you can find your way into the sports world.
Bring something to the table. I mean, the only way to make it work the other way is to have like the last name McPhail. That's about
Right.
it, you know. But so, all right, so excuse me. I in my first conversations with Don Fear and with the union, the issue really was how well are the clubs doing? How do you measure their success? What's sort of the pulse of the industry? But remember, in some ways, I was like the guy who landed on Mars and was learning about a whole new world. I knew how to study an industry, but I didn't know about the industry.
Mm.
And that's been a lot of the last quarter century. And over time, that mission has evolved to how's the industry changing? Where are the fissures or the divisions within it that are something that the union wants to explore? What are the major influences that are going to drive it? How is the market for player talent evolving? And as my understanding of the industry has grown, and right now I think that it's as good as it can be if you're not you or lawyers who have been involved in it their whole
Right.
careers. The way to apply economic thinking has grown along with it.
Yeah, and one of the things you mentioned about the way you evaluate players. I mean, certainly we've seen some changes there in recent years. There was a time when all you had to do was look at the back of the bubblegum card, and
Right.
you had certain stats. They were core stats, and that's what you looked at. And that certainly has changed. But what are some of the other changes that you've seen, whether it's in economics or otherwise, in the industry since you've started? Certainly, the amount of money has changed.
The,
But are there any other things that the biggest changes that you've seen in the industry?
well, look, the money certainly has changed. And right now, the driving force behind the money, that sports is an internet play, is very different. But that's simply the most recent chapter of a longer book, because when I first started thinking about baseball, and I'm talking about just as a guy in the '70s, the '80s maybe, the owners were quote unquote sportsmen who were like the Galbraith family in Pittsburgh, who just thought it was cool to have a baseball team, or they were beer merchants or used car dealers like Bud Selig, who were somewhat civic minded, but who were there because owning a baseball team was cool, and they were. I mean, in a sense, they looked like the Johns in a police raid. Just a
Right.
bunch of old puffy guys,
Hmm.
right, who thought that it was fun to have baseball and so on. The economics changed, partly driven by Steinbrenner, who he and Finley were the two owners who had a pocket full of thought about what you could do with baseball, and neither of them had the personality that made it easy for them to make their point. But a wave of new owners came in who saw baseball as a growth proposition, and they turned into guys who come out of hedge funds or other successful businesses who saw baseball as a money-making opportunity, and they fueled the long-term wave of growth that I think went up through to 2008 and the recession in that year. And now we're seeing the same kind of more technically minded and savvy
Mhm.
ownership, but the economics have changed because of the internet and these massive inflations in franchise values. So the name of the game has changed. It's less important now to make an operating profit than it is to show revenue growth, because that's what the market for franchises responds to. Uh, there's a there's a bit of a bubble here. Uh, the industry isn't quite like those old Warner Brothers cartoons when the guy runs off the cliff and they play bongo music until he figures out that he's about to drop.
Right.
We're not there yet. I'm not saying that,
Mhm.
but when you look at Jeter paying 1.2 billion for the Marlins, uh, there's a lot of revenue in there that hasn't been made yet. And I don't think the answer to the question, how do you make it, has been answered, has been
Hmm.
solved.
I mean, that's interesting, Ev. I mean, because we've seen, there was a time when Bud Selig would go around to the editorial boards of the newspapers located in major league cities and cry broke, right? Back in
Right?
the early 2000s, and contraction. Many people may remember the idea of getting rid of two or more teams that baseball was espousing. But since there's been a change, right? I mean, now the latest figures I saw was baseball was at $10 billion. as an industry. And so there's been some real growth, but you seem to think that there are some concerns on the horizon.
Well, I worry about where franchise prices are, but let me speak to that. In fact, that was kind of that was a bad period, the late 90s, early 2000s. Baseball was losing money, and the losses were driven by the fact that you had four clubs. You had Toronto and Rogers Media, Atlanta and Time Warner, and the Yankees, and who else was in this bag then? The Dodgers, which were owned by Fox. You also had Disney in there. And those media clubs, those clubs that were owned by media companies, were out putting together big contracts that the rest of the industry couldn't afford. The industry was losing money in 2000 and 2001, but over 80% of the losses were experienced by clubs that were owned by media companies who thought, I don't care if the Braves lose money. Right? And the Braves were one of the highest salary teams back then. Remember, we're talking about the Glavine, Maddox, Smoltz teams, right? Who cares if they lose money? We're making it up on the Time Warner side. And that was a lot of the problem. The problem solved itself partly because the market for players softened starting in 2003, and partly because some of those media companies got out, like Fox and Disney. We don't need to own this; we can contract it, right? And that led to a new period of growth and profitability when the industry started growing during the economic boom of the first decade. The new century. Now, the industry is back to losing money, and I believe that on a cash basis, it is losing some money, but you don't hear any whining about it, and you don't hear whining about it first because the asset value has skyrocketed, just skyrocketed. All of baseball was worth around $16-15 billion less than 10 years ago, and now it's worth around $45 billion. And perhaps more telling is that the industry was worth around 2.5 times its revenue less than 10 years ago, and now it's worth 5 times its revenue. And that ratio, that multiple that establishes the value of franchises is going up only because sentiment is changing. Nothing underlying it is changing. But people look at baseball and they think with the internet and so on, there must be a pony in there.
So Ev, help me understand, and maybe even others understand, how can you have that kind of a calculus, right? Where you said the industry may be losing money, and but yet the asset or the franchise values are increasing. And to the extent that you can have that kind of dynamic, what is the concern, if any, with that kind of a mixture?
Well, look, there's an expectation throughout sports that the internet and internet-based entertainment and the like are going to bring new sources of revenue to the industry, new opportunities, but we're not exactly sure what they are yet. And that, I think, is a lot of the thinking behind these increases in value. The sources of revenue that franchises receive in sports have not changed that dramatically. You've got gate and gate-related revenue. You've got advertising and promotion. That has increased somewhat, partly because baseball is one of the remaining places to reach a mass market, either nationally or regionally. And then you've got television, and that's where I think people expect to see internet distribution move the industry ahead. But right now, all sports to some extent, to some common great extent, are depend on the cable distribution model, which is that cable companies will put together a big bundle of content and sell it to the household. And even though there's some content that everybody doesn't want, the cable company's buying power makes it all cheap. I think that part is true. Right? But there's going to be a point where the internet makes cable evolve as a way to watch sports, and that's still up in the air. And how that works out has a lot to say with whether or not franchise values can be sustained.
Right. But we're seeing some of that now, though, right? I mean, in terms of, especially with the younger generation that doesn't sit in front of a television set and doesn't feel the need to have the large cable bundle, the cutting the cord and those types of things, the downloading and the streaming, that, again, the 20 somethings, 30 somethings, are more apt to do than, my age and your age, perhaps. So we're seeing some of that now, aren't we? Where, um, but what you're saying is there's an expectation of growth in that area and continued growth, but maybe it's not realized and we don't know where it is, but that expectation is sort of driving things here going forward.
Well, let's start with the cord cutting, because that really is that's the nose of the camel coming into the tent. What happens when the millennial generation that is getting used to cord cutting, that gave up their landline, right, and it's entirely possible give up their cable and simply stream entertainment, right, including stuff like watching a ball game on a phone, which I just don't understand at all.
Right.
There you go. What happens then? That remains to be seen. There's some interesting stuff that goes on. For example, Steve Ballmer, the president of Microsoft, the once was president of Microsoft, who bought the Clippers in the NBA, and had $20-odd billion and decided it would be fun to spend two of them on a franchise. He's coming up with a lot of interesting things about how internet-based viewing can allow you as the consumer to change the way you're looking at play while it's underway, to move the camera perspective, to adopt different ways of looking at the game, to treat it with color or effects and so on. Well, that's possible, but it all remains to be seen. It well could be that in 10 years, the model is that for $250, you buy your club's baseball games on the internet. And that's how it works. It's not a matter of getting a cable package. But, that's all of that sort of up in the air. A very distant second in this race is the question of international. But baseball has done a particularly bad job on international. it really doesn't seem to have a plan, and I think that's more important for other franchises.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the things when we talk about, as you were just describing, it's sort of the future, and no one really knows where it's going. We have this expectation and all that. I tend to think this is what's going on in esports, for example, right? That there's this expectation that there's money to be made there. Many people don't want to be left out of the possibility of cashing in. And so a lot of people get in, but they really aren't quite sure what they're getting into. And maybe I just don't understand it, or maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but I sort of see that as, sort of part and parcel of what you were talking about here with the internet and where, major sports industry believes the economics are going. What do you think about that?
Well, look, if first the esports thing, maybe if we have a free week, you can explain to me the attraction of that. I don't get it, but that that's the the market is like the heart. It wants what it wants. You can't
Right.
second guess it because it's going to do what it's going to do that way. Um, During the run-up to the financial meltdown in 2008, the chairman of Citibank, a guy named Prince, made the not the musician, made the remark that it was crazy, but as long as the music was playing, you got to keep dancing.
Mm-hmm.
And that is exactly, I think, what you're talking about there, that the music is playing and there are folks who want in, right? They've got the resources, they can raise the cash, they think that they might be able to solve the problem, and so they want to play. Now, it's becoming an expensive ticket, right? Which is going to be in some sense where the discipline comes somewhere down the line, right? But we see no signs of it yet. If you're buying a major sports franchise, what you're buying is an entertainment product that is fairly well positioned, that has some room on the price point for tickets and perhaps for cable type media, that has this glimmering horizon of broadband streaming distribution and other stuff, right? And you've got to assign some kind of value to that, and that's the calculus that's being made. I find it surprising. Is it sustainable? As John Maynard Keynes once said, in the long run, we're all dead.
Right.
Or as they say on Wall Street, trees don't grow to the sky.
Yeah.
Right? Everything at some point reaches a limit, but that's not a helpful maxim, because that's like saying it's going to get dark tonight between 3 and 11.
Right.
It doesn't tell you what's about to go on,
Right.
There are no signs of that right now. Just look at the numbers and watch carefully, because that ultimately is the greatest indicator of the health of a sports industry, or really any industry, the willingness of capital to enter the industry.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, there are still many more potential entrants than there are people who want out. And
Right.
you can see this movie run in reverse. In the same decade that baseball was growing, '03 to '08, hockey was in terrible shape, and there were hockey clubs, hockey owners, who were throwing their keys on the table in front of Bettman and saying, "The hell with this, I'm out. I'm just not going to do this anymore." And he spent the better part of a bunch of years running around trying to find owners for the franchises that he placed in places where hockey is not a natural thing,
Right.
like Dallas and Florida and so on.
Right.
There was a famous remark by a guy in the Nashville Current, I think the name of the paper is, that hockey is ice golf played by foreigners from Canuckistan. And, and Gary became commissioner because his program was, we must become a national sport to get national TV money. And he then put hockey into places, where the soil didn't fit. And in some places it's worked because a guy who's got some visionary ability like Vinnick in Tampa has turned the Lightning into a real thing down there. And in some places it's just foundered completely. So it's possible to get there, but that's what you have to watch. As long as the people with capital want to enter are lined up outside the door, and in baseball, I think they certainly are, then there's smooth sailing ahead. But these underlying questions, and I'm not saying that it's going to end up failing. I'm saying that the way in which they'll be answered, particularly how we manage the transition from the cable aggregator of content model to streaming, right, to the Trumpian 400-pound guy laying on his bed somewhere.
Right.
Right. We're looking to see signals somewhere that someone has really thought this out.
Right. Are there any concerns as we sort of move away from that cable aggregation model that you talked about to streaming and other things? And I know there's been some talk about, how virtual reality may factor in here as well. But, as we get into the technology and the streaming and all these other types of things, are there any concerns from the player side? Because you worked on the player side of what that means for players. Because, especially in the sports where you have caps, right? Where you have defined revenue. And I don't know if because I know you've done work in hockey. Would these new forms of revenue fit in with some of the current models, or is that something that the union has to make sure that they stay abreast of and negotiate into their agreements?
Well, boy, you've stepped on a mine. This is an open question. Let me fall back one step. Football, ever since Pete Rozelle, shares all of its revenue from television, from media, equally. And that means that something like 3/4 of the revenue that comes into a franchise comes from these central sources, and it's divided evenly among the group. Baseball central revenue is the national TV contract, but the national TV contract is trivial compared to, well, trivial is a hard word, but it's not dominant the way the local TV deal is. So in baseball, only 25% of the revenue is centralized. And that goes to the heart of the model that has driven baseball players, the players' union, from day one. That is, and this is an interesting thing about sports unions generally. They are the only unions whose radical demand is a free market. That's pretty wild, isn't it?
Right,
and
it is.
When you, as Marvin Miller used to say, and as Don Fear used to say, that every sports negotiation is the clubs coming to the players and saying, we're terrible business people who make terrible decisions. You
Right.
need to protect us from ourselves.
Right.
And it's, in this kind of phony proto-socialist nonsense of theirs, that's what you got to watch out for. In baseball, the players have successfully resisted all attempts to change that model. No matter what the criticisms have been, they've got a perfect history of keeping that model intact. So right now, if you're a club in baseball and you want to stream your games and give them to, send them out to your market, right? You've got to get the permission of baseball. Now, baseball has been signing some master agreements with companies like Fox and Comcast that run between them most of the regional sports networks that put baseball on cable. But baseball has reserved its right, and this started under Selig. This is like going back 15 years, to control internet distribution. And I think that part of that was because the clubs back then, talking about the 2000 to 2005 period, looked at this internet thing and thought, geez, if Steinbrenner and the Dodgers, and the Cubs get ahead of us on this internet stuff, the inequities or the unequal distribution of revenue between rich and poor clubs is going to get worse. So let's put a break on that. Now the situation is different. The union has told baseball, I don't think it's a secret, that it's watching that with great interest. And we have heard some club owners say that it's time to change the model. So there's a question about where it's going. But, you look at, for example, what we were talking about earlier about what the Clippers are doing with interesting internet approaches to televising or distributing games. It's not happening in baseball. There's nothing really interesting going on there. And I think that the industry's growth would be a lot better, a lot stronger if internet rights were unambiguously given to the clubs and they were told, go knock yourself out, negotiate a deal with your cable company, or, for example, Seattle, the Stanton, the technology executive who just bought the Mariners, also controls 80% of Root Sports, his cable company. He's in a perfect position to say, all right, this is how we're going to do it from now on, particularly in Seattle, which is a millennial high-tech community where they get more people showing up for soccer games than they do for baseball games most of the time.
Right.
I hope, and to a lesser extent, I predict that at some point baseball ownership is going to say that the transition from cable to the internet is too important to be left to Rob Manfred and the guys who work over on Park Avenue in Manhattan. Let us, the club owners, decide how that's going to work. That is a Rubicon that one day is going to have to be crossed.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting because, there was a time, I remember, Ev, when I started, and, every club had control over their website, right? I mean, this was shortly after Al Gore invented the internet, right? So every club had control over their website, and it was a mess. I mean, there were some clubs that were doing a great job, and other clubs were doing a terrible job. Is there any danger with doing that? I mean, certainly there's some upside, right, of allowing clubs to, be creative and to go out and do some things and maybe drive the market. But do you think that from baseball's perspective, they think that there's too much of a downside, so they're going to want to always centrally control it?
Well, I think that the desire for central control doesn't come out of the same, engine that what we're talking about 15 years ago did. The standardizing the websites and using Central Baseball to help the guys who are not up to speed is one thing. Controlling how they deploy a major and growing source of revenue is something else completely. Right now, the impetus for keeping the internet centralized comes from a couple of sources. First, you've got an established bureaucracy within MLB, that BAM, right? Baseball Advanced Media, that is out there doing well. I mean, they're doing very well,
Sure.
producing revenue, improving their institutional clout, right? So that's there. And you've got low-end clubs who think I'm better off just letting this happen. You look at a market like Milwaukee or Pittsburgh, which are very small compared to a lot of the major and mid-sized markets, and they're thinking, I'm making 25, 30 on cable. The Yankees and Phillies are making 125. So maybe I'll be happy if we kind of socialize internet access. But the way to deal with that is through revenue sharing and through redistribution within the industry, which has its own problems. But otherwise, it becomes a textbook example of an age-old economic problem, and that is the folks who were the losers because of economic growth and change try to obstruct economic growth and change because that's the only hammer they have in search of their nail. It's the same stuff as Trump telling coal miners they're going to get their jobs back, or somehow that tariffs on Chinese steel and aluminum are going to bring back those jobs. They're not. It's too late for that. And in fact, they disappeared not because of trade, but because technology made the workers so productive that you needed a very small number of them compared to where we were 50, 60 years ago.
Right.
So there's an age-old economic story. The losers hold up the process. They put sand in the gears. Like the sabots of the 18th century, they throw their wooden shoes into the looms to break them, right? Where we got the word sabotage. It's an economic word, the Economist said proudly. So there's a real governance issue for baseball,
Right.
and it requires a very strong commissioner. I don't think baseball has that, and it requires a dialogue among the owners that's conducted among serious, thoughtful people. That there are serious and thoughtful people among ownership, but they're so divergent. The only thing baseball owners have in common is their owners. Otherwise, they come from different corners of the universe in many ways. You got hedge fund managers and beer distributors. And they can talk numbers, but that doesn't mean they're talking a common language. So, yeah, that's an issue. That's a problem. And I think all eyes in the industry are on that space to see what happens there. Because it goes to whether or not franchise prices are bubbling, right? Whether or not clubs are going to control their own futures online, right?
Mm-hmm.
What the new model is going to be, all roads lead to that one point.
Man, that was just part one of our interview with Economist Ev Ehrlich. I encourage you to come on back for part two as Ev continues to share his knowledge and insight on the sports industry and the economics that drive the game. As always, share your thoughts with us. Let us know how we're doing. We promise to keep taking it to new levels. Until next time, we gotta go. Scully is waiting in the wings to take us home. But we look forward to seeing you again on the next edition of Sports 360.